Hi, I'm Kate Warren, Executive Vice President at Devex, and I'm delighted to welcome Johanna Mercier, who's the Chief Commercial Officer at Gilead, to discuss how pharma can play a role in expanding access to medicines globally. So Johanna, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So in today's program, we are taking a look at the future of health systems. And it is estimated that some 2 billion people do not have access to modern medicine. And as COVID-19 crisis is made more clear than ever, expanding access to medicine is a critical component to advancing health outcomes, during this pandemic and beyond. And Gilead has been involved in global health since the early 2000s, I believe, when you made your first HIV drugs available globally. So Johanna, how do you see pharmaceutical companies like Gilead's role in advancing access to medicine in low and middle income countries?
I think it's a really critical role, actually. It's a challenging one nonetheless, but a very critical one. And I think, I can only speak for Gilead Sciences, but I do believe that it's across the industry. It's one thing to discover and develop new medicines and innovative therapies. But if it doesn't get into the hands of patients that need them, then we've failed. And I think it's an incredible opportunity for us to make sure that we're not just thinking in the developed world, but also the developing world. And I think Gilead Sciences was able to accomplish some of this just most recently with remdesivir in the last 12 months or so, because of the experiences that we'd had before that you referred to in HIV, for example, but also in HCV in low and middle income countries, as well as the developed world.
Yeah, and so, thinking about your past work in HIV treatment, how did that help inform your approach to delivering access during COVID-19? What were some of the common barriers you've seen and ways that you've been able to try to overcome them?
Yeah, I think that our mandate with remdesivir was obviously first and foremost quite the challenge, right? You had to ensure that this medicine could actually have impact for COVID-19 patients. And so there's a lot of work being done from a development standpoint. So we had a full development work stream working through to understand not only, activity versus in vitro, but also activity then in humans, right? And understanding that through clinical trials that we started, some in China, and then of course in the US followed very quickly thereafter. So there's a lot of work going on clinically, and we can go into detail if you'd like on that front. There was also enormous amount of work from a manufacturing standpoint. And the reason for that is end-to-end manufacturing of remdesivir was originally 12 months. And we knew that we didn't have 12 months. And so if this was going to be an efficacious and safe treatment for patients, we needed to try to streamline the manufacturing process. And so there was a full team on that. And I would compare that as kind of a lot of kudos to the manufacturing team, but it was basically you're flying the plane and you're building it as you're flying it. And how do you streamline? Because some of the chemical reactions were actually sequential. And so you couldn't cut down that time. So you really had to think through where could you accelerate? And we were able to, the team did an amazing job and actually bring it down all the way down to about 6 months, which really helped from a supply standpoint to accelerate supply. All of the work I just described from a manufacturing or development standpoint was actually done at risk. We didn't know yet if we had a product in COVID-19 patients, but we felt we had no time to lose, and that if we were to have a product, then what we needed to do is get it out to patients. So as things were moving forward, we also understood that it was going to be challenging in the developed world, and that COVID-19 was not being picky about who it decided to affect, which countries were affected. And we're seeing that still today in many countries around the world. And so it didn't matter if they were richer countries, poorer countries, south of the equator, north of the equator. I mean, there was a lot of assumptions that were done early on that were wrong. And I think everybody, unfortunately, this has been truly a global pandemic. One of the things we knew was and it's not just we knew, we had a goal. Gilead had a very clear goal that it was about access and affordability. And it goes back to my earlier statement that if you're going to work on a medicine, you don't want just a few people getting that medicine. You want whoever is appropriate for that medicine to get the treatment they deserve. And so the philosophy was no patient is left behind. And that's exactly how we leveraged a little bit the work that was done in the past through an incredible team at Gilead that really focuses on the developing world countries and what they had done in HIV. And what they had done both in HIV and HCV is basically leverage the technical expertise, transfer that technical expertise to generic manufacturers in certain countries like India, Pakistan and Egypt are examples with remdesivir, to make sure that they can ramp up supply. So there was two goals for this. One is we knew that not just Gilead on its own, despite all the partnerships that we had around the world, including pharmaceutical partnerships, we weren't going to be able to ramp up fast enough. And so there was an incredible opportunity to make sure that we leveraged all the different sources that we could actually see potential for ramp up. And so by doing voluntary licenses with these generic manufacturers, and these are very similar generic manufacturers that we leverage, that we had relationships with from our HIV, HCV days. And so there was an opportunity to give that technical expertise, show them how it was done, and for them to basically ramp up their own manufacturing and supply, the generic remdesivir, in those low income and some middle income countries, so that many of those, because there were multiple generic manufacturers, they competed on price, and the price obviously was able to be much more reasonable and much more in line with those markets and what they can afford, right? And so that's how it played out. And I just want to add one piece, and this is in my first year at Gilead as we're working through this. I was just amazed. I mean, we did this with no royalties during the pandemic, and the intent was really around, here's the supply, ramp up the supply, and ensure access to all those patients that will need remdesivir. So that's how we leverage the HIV, HCV learnings, but also the team that pulled this together was really impressive. And a lot of them had been on those work streams in the past for HCV or HIV, and we're basically pulling it through for remdesivir.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And this voluntary licensing has, I think, been proven to be a very effective method for expanding access for the points you just raised. Curious to see how you think local manufacturing capacity could be boosted to continue to reduce low and middle income countries' dependence on imported medicines, ramp up that capacity of local manufacturers. What are you seeing effective methods for approaching that?
Yeah, I think you always have to find the balance of what makes sense, right? Because you want to make sure that you have enough generic manufacturers that are involved, that you have the right generic manufacturers, because there's a quality piece to this as well that is really important. And it's also one that, the contracts that we have with them are specific to about 127 countries around the world that they would supply if needed. And so I think that there needs to be certain guardrails. There's no doubt about that, or else I think then the development of new medicines would be at risk. And so I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. But I also believe that, you have to be conscious of healthcare savings and making sure that it gives back to the system so that it becomes a sustainable model moving forward. So I think sustainability is really important here, is how you think about it and who and where you go to support this. And, I also think that it might work for certain medicines versus others, right? I think some medicines that are, sometimes if you think about, depending where the countries are in their healthcare, some medicines might not be appropriate at this point in time. It really depends on the healthcare framework and system that they operate in. So I think we just need to make sure that, we customize a little bit how we approach different systems, and we help the people that want to be helped, right? And so it's really about making sure we partner with governments, we partner with institutions. It's not about doing this ourselves. It's about, the expression about teaching somebody to fish and they'll eat for, the rest of their days. It's kind of the same concept, is how do we partner together with these countries to get to a solution? One of them is voluntary licenses, but there's a lot more than that. And Gilead Sciences is very involved in just starting from the basics, which is education, especially if you think about HIV. I think that plays a very important role if you want to end this epidemic in HIV. And so it's really bringing different pieces of the puzzle together, I think is important. It's not just one thing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, in our audience today, we have many global health professionals working with governments, NGOs, multilateral institutions, health tech startups. And so, how do you work with these various stakeholders, and what advice would you give to those tuning in today as to how they could help in these efforts to expand access and how they could engage with pharmaceuticals like Gilead?
Yeah, I mean, I think Gilead's engaged with many of them. There's incredible connections, and we've learned so much, and I really talk about partnership because I think it's important. It's not just one company or one NGO, right? It's about coming together. And I know that takes a little bit more time and sometimes a little bit more effort, but the outcome is just so much greater if you work together. And I would even add academic institutions, right, from the WHO to like bigger foundations as well. Like there's so many different pieces of the puzzle that can come together. I do think that when there's a will, there's a way. So I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. And, I think about even just what just happened most recently in what is happening currently today in India. As you think about the incredible crisis that they've been in for the last few months now, and how different people, they leverage their embassies to kind of reach out to different folks across different countries to try to get access to oxygen tanks, remdesivir, other medicines, vaccines, et cetera, and what they needed to do. And, through discussions with the Indian government, we were able to kind of move pretty quickly and do a couple of things. One is, within about 4 days, to be honest with you, a small team of us came together and we basically defined, okay, how much product do we have? How much can we send? How quickly can we get it there? And I think that was the biggest issue, is transportation, by the way. It was actually one of our challenges, was to define a donation of 450,000 vials of remdesivir to get it out to India as quickly as possible. And of course, working with the government very closely for the import licenses and all the paperwork that needed to be done. We turned that around in 4 days. And, I'm super proud of the team on that front, to be honest with you, because everybody had the same goal, was to help. How do we help? And it was extremely powerful. And I saw so many other, you talk about, the different folks on this call, so many people were like, how do I help? What can I do? And everybody kind of came together on that front in different ways. And there was different opportunities to help, and including other pharmaceutical companies, to be honest, that were less closely linked to COVID-19 treatment or vaccines. And so I think that's extremely powerful, how we can come together. The other thing that we did is, obviously, we knew that the generic manufacturers in India that we had a voluntary license with, there was 7 of them, had slowed down their manufacturing originally because they didn't think they would be in this situation. And so they were ramping up. And as I explained earlier, the manufacturing of this product is a lengthy process. And so what we also did is, how do we help them? How do we help them accelerate their process? How do we give them potentially API, active pharmaceutical ingredient, to some of our voluntary licenses to kind of speed up and ramp up that process, and make sure that not only India gets served, but making sure those 125 other countries don't get lost in this mix and also have a challenge getting remdesivir. So I think all of those pieces were super important, and I think appreciated. And I think that it was incredible to see how a lot of people came together, governments came together to give oxygen tanks, to give different medical equipment and treatments that the Indian people really needed and still need to this day. The ramp up, we feel now, in India, they should be in a really good position by the end of the month. And we've also seen the numbers come down, thankfully, which also, both of those things kind of help the whole situation. But I would just say, like, those are the kind of things that we can come together and partner. And we've had so many emails that we actually had a bit of a customer-centric approach on this one to make sure that no email got left unanswered. anybody who wanted to help got brought into the mix. And so to your earlier questions about how can we, I think in times of crisis, not just the industry, but all our partners come together so beautifully. It's impressive. And I wish we could do that on a more day-to-day basis, to be honest.
Yeah, well, let's hope that that can be one of the bright spots of this, is the lessons learned heading into the future. Well, thank you so much, Johanna, for taking the time to share your experience with our audience today. I know I learned a lot from the conversation, as I'm sure those listening in did as well. So thank you.
Well, thanks for having me, Kate. And I just want to say, this isn't a one company thing. Of course, I'm sharing the Gilead examples, but I mean, as horrible as this pandemic was and still is, because it's not over until everybody's out of it. I do think it has brought a lot of us together and showed us what we can do and how quickly we can do it. Obviously, always based on science, but really driving that forth. And I just want to say thank you. Great,
thank you. Now I will hand it off to my colleague Amrita for conversation with WHO's Chief Scientist, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan. So over to you, Amrita, and thank you again, Johanna.